we're taking a look at Test 1, Section 2, Question 7. Question 7 is, they consider it a Level 3 question, but I think it can be harder than a Level 3 for a lot of people. And remember, Level 3 is a medium-based question. If you don't know what these rhetorical devices are, or what these literary terms are, you're going to definitely struggle with this one. So most kids tend to get this question wrong. If you had skipped it, it was probably a good skip, unless you were sure of what those words mean. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. Okay, so the first thing is to focus on the question, which is basically just asking us, what is the rhetorical device primarily? So in general, used throughout. That's an important thing whenever we see primary, right? We don't want to just focus on one thing that happens. We want to focus on throughout the entire thing. So in this case, we're thinking about literary devices. So it's written very in a very fancy way, I would say. And a lot of kids read this and have a hard time even understanding what's going on. So if you got it wrong, don't feel too bad. This might have been a better skip for you to answer, or to skip rather than to answer. And so that's always something important to remember too, because you have to remember when to skip. Because if you're shooting for anything under a 600, you need to skip quite a few questions, at least 4 to 5 per section, in order to be able to, break that 500 to get to the 600 mark. But then you also need to get the rest correct. So that's the key. But this, again, is a good skip for a lot of people. Okay, so what we're going to do is, it's kind of hard to actively read to find the answer in this case, because there are mostly 1 or 2 word answer choices. I would say let's go right to the answers and see what we can figure out. So we're going to try to eliminate the wrong answer choices first. A is an appeal to emotion. A lot of kids tend to pick that because of the last sentence. It felt good to be human is an emotion, to feel good. The problem with this is, it's not the general idea. That's only mentioned about how he or she feels one time. So since it's not the general idea, it's not the primary idea, which, remember, whenever we see that word in an answer choice, it's so important. It means the whole thing, like almost a thesis statement that you would write for this paragraph or a passage. And that's only one line. Of course, the trap is that it's the last line, but it doesn't mean that it's correct. So we got to get rid of that, because really there's no emotions described up until the last sentence. So let's take a look at B. Metaphorical language. Okay. Using metaphors throughout. So metaphors are comparisons throughout, right? So what I'm going to look, do they use comparisons throughout the whole thing? So he does a couple of different times use metaphors. He says the comet Hale-Bopp hung like a feathery fish. And then he also compares humans to horses. So I would keep it, although I'm not 100% about that one. Now C, extended analogy. Okay, so what's hard about this one is a metaphor can often be an analogy. An analogy is a comparison of two things. So what's the difference here, right? Because if a metaphorical language is kind of thinking of comparison, and then we're looking at analogy, and that's similar to comparison. So what makes this particular answer choice wrong is the word extended. An extended analogy would mean that throughout the entire thing, they're comparing two things over and over again. They've extended an analogy throughout the whole thing, and they haven't. The reason why B is better, and again, like I was saying earlier, I think this is tough, but I think B is better because you have two or more different metaphors. And here they're looking for one long extended one, and I'm not seeing that. So that's why I would get rid of C. Okay, let's take a look at D. A flashback. That one's relatively easy to get rid of because it never talks about looking back at anything. And then irony is also relatively easy to get rid of, as long as you know that it means that the opposite of what was expected. And I don't think he ever mentions any kind of surprise, or that, something was different than what he anticipated, which would be the opposite of what he was thinking. So I think D and E are relatively easy to get rid of. I can see how A, B, and C could be difficult. If you had it narrowed down to these three and you really weren't sure, this would have been a good skip. This is what tends to happen with most kids. They get rid of D and E, they have three left and they don't know what to do. If you have three left and you're really unsure, skip it. Because you don't need to pick up every answer to get a good score on this test. If you were going for 7 to 800s, then of course you would definitely need to think about answering this one. You got to look at every single word in the answer choice. Again, the idea that in general it wasn't about emotion and that it wasn't an extended analogy, which is what makes B better. Okay, let's take a quick second to see if we can review some of these skills that we used to get the correct answer. Okay, so for the most part, we definitely used vocabulary, because if you didn't know what those words meant, then it would have been a good skip. And remember, if you don't know a word, put a question mark next to it. The more question marks you have, the more likely you should be to skip. It was also a whole passage question, because it was saying primarily in the passage. And then we also used, well, I would say those are the most things, but we did also use concrete words. You know, we got rid of certain ones for saying the extended analogy would have been wrong, and the emotion would have been wrong, because that would have only answered the last, that would have been only relevant to the last sentence. Okay, so tough question. Keep plugging away. Thanks for watching.